Hello everyone, this is Inside China Consumer and I'm Xiaoqi. Today we'd like to share a topic that you might be very interested in. We've noticed that every 2 years, the baking industry sees a surge of popular brands and hit products, from pork floss cakes and raw toast to butter rice cakes. As trends shift, some people happily become bread lovers visiting weekly, while others wonder why a loaf of toast can cost 200 yuan. Complaining while waiting in line, people seem to find it hard to resist the pleasure brought by flour and butter. Regarding this topic, as consumer specialist, we actually have many observations of our own. So today, we've invited 2 colleagues from Genbridge Capital. One is Danny, who focuses on food and beverage investment. The other is Chen Xia, our investor, and also a loyal baking enthusiast. Alright, now let's have Chen Xia and Danny say hello to us.
Hello everyone, I'm Danny.
Hello everyone, I'm Chen Xia.
Okay, let's start by talking about some of the phenomena we've observed. Chen Xia, could you start by telling us, as a baking enthusiast, why do you like buying it? Because I've noticed you seem to go to bakeries almost every week to pick out some products, and you have your own favourite bakeries. Could you share a bit with everyone?
Yes, my consumption of these baked goods is actually mainly as a meal replacement for my 3 daily meals, primarily breakfast. And also, for example, because I might want to go hiking every week, and during hiking there's actually no supply of regular meals. So at times like that, baked products are actually a very good portable meal replacement option that can serve as a filling staple food. So this is the main scenario for my consumption of baked products.
What about Danny?
I buy baked goods too. For me, it's more for leisure scenarios like binge watching shows at home or gathering with friends. But the occasions where I have them as a main meal are actually quite rare.
So I understand that the things you buy for leisure should be smaller in size. Is that different from the main meals Chen Xia mentioned?
Right, because the scope of baking is actually quite broad. For example, things like bread, cakes and desserts all fall under the category of baking. From what I understand of what Chen Xia said, for breakfast, she might buy more bread-like items like European bread, toast or prepared breads. These are more like main meals. Right, whereas I buy more cake-like items like cheesecake, egg tarts, or Chinese-style baked goods like pork floss cakes and cream puffs.
So even though you're both baking consumers, you're actually 2 completely different types of consumers, and your consumption habits are very different. So have you roughly calculated how much you spend on this every week, for example?
I probably go and buy once or twice a week, and each time I might spend 20 to 30 yuan. Since I usually eat alone, and because these products can't be stored for a very long time, I basically buy enough for 1 or 2 meals at a time, so that's roughly my consumption frequency and amount.
I'm similar to Chen Xia. Each time it's mainly through delivery, because when I'm binge watching shows at home or when I'm bored, I might want to buy some of these baked desserts.
Do you guys have any bakeries that you're particularly fond of, or ones you visit often?
Lately, I've been going to Bakeries Bakery quite a bit, and another one called Luxihe. I often buy from these 2 brands because they really fit my lifestyle and needs. I'm quite conscious of calories, so I look for things like pretzel bread or items with less oil and sugar, but that still taste healthy and delicious. So I think Bakeries Bakery has a lot of those pretzel breads that don't feel heavy, but they add things like chocolate for flavor so it doesn't feel high calorie, but still gives you that sense of happiness.
Right, just to add, Chen Xia is our company's famous healthy living and fat loss practitioner, so she's very focused on calories when choosing these products, right?
Right.
Danny, on the other hand, doesn't seem to care much about calories.
Yeah, I'm definitely not as professional as Zhou when it comes to calories. I usually have 2 scenarios for buying bread. One is near the office because there's a toast le jour right downstairs. Yeah, I really like getting a fresh cup of coffee in the morning, especially with their tasty sausage bread, or sometimes a soft pork floss bread, or maybe even a sweet coconut bread for breakfast, or just as a quick snack. And at shopping malls, I might go to larger, more comprehensive bakeries like B&C or some of the newer brands such as Rukuganghao, because they tend to have a much wider selection of baked goods. These places usually offer a variety of breads, pastries and cakes, so there's always something interesting to choose from.
So you're more driven by new brands or products. Once a new brand pops up, you're curious and want to try it out, right?
I am curious about brands, but once you go in, you realize that even though the brands are different, the types of bread and the taste are usually pretty much the same.
Speaking of which, I have a question. Every once in a while, we see a few brands becoming incredibly popular, but as you said, the variety and taste aren't that different. So why do these trendy bakeries get so famous? For example, we all know B&C. Even now, people are still lining up at their Sanlitun store. Why is that?
Well, to answer your first question about why they get popular, it usually comes down to two things. First is whether they have a viral new product, like the pork floss cakes in Chinese baking, or more recently, the butter rice cakes. These viral hits can drive a brand or even a whole category to explode in popularity and create those long lines. And in Western-style bakeries, the launch of Hollyland's half-baked cheesecake really drove the rapid rise of that brand. So I think the first dimension is definitely product-driven, with new generations of viral hits driving brand growth. The second reason they get popular is more about the store's interior design and the overall atmosphere and experience. Right, so the main external reason B&C became so popular initially was probably its European-style design. Yeah, before that, you probably didn't see bakeries with that kind of decor. It felt more like a European castle or something.
Like a jewelry store.
Right, or a jewelry store, or that kind of lifestyle vibe. So it definitely won over consumers with its atmosphere and environment. Including the recently popular ones like Rukuanghao, they've actually taken this environment a step further. For example, they have a rotating selection of product recommendations, and they use an island-style bread prep station where good-looking staff work right there in the middle. It provides a more immersive, fresh-baked experience, giving consumers a sense of novelty through the environment and atmosphere. I think that's all about the decor and creating an atmosphere. Right, but in the end, if you ask why people keep lining up, or why B&C still has good sales and queues today, I think it comes down to the value for money. It looks very high-end with great decor and a wide variety of products, but the prices are actually quite affordable. It's good value.
Just to add, the unit price for a loaf of bread at B&C is roughly between 15 and 25 yuan.
Right, let me add to that. I think baking is an industry that relies heavily on emotional value. When people buy it, besides just needing a staple or a meal to fill up, most of the time it's about rewarding themselves or having a relaxing, pleasant moment. So in this field, it's very important to integrate or build that emotional value into the category effectively. Besides what Danny mentioned, I think creating online buzz is key. For instance, how well you use online traffic channels like Xiaohongshu, Meituan, and Dianping is a crucial factor in creating a hit product. Then there's the offline aspect. Beyond the display and decor, I think the aroma is huge. When I go to Joy City and walk past those bakeries on the first floor, that smell makes it really hard not to go inside. So I think throughout the entire online and offline experience, it all comes down to the operational ability to create a hit.
Right, we just used B&C as an example to talk about why people will wait in line for these viral bakeries and how they create this internet-famous phenomenon. But I have a question here. We've noticed that these viral trends seem to come in waves every 2 or 3 years. On that note, does anyone have a counterexample of a brand that stays popular long-term? Or is there an example where you felt they hit the jackpot with timing and location, but even after they blew up, you could see why they might eventually fade away?
I think this isn't just in the baking industry. In the broader food and beverage sector, it's actually very hard to maintain that level of explosive popularity or stay a viral hit indefinitely. For example, when Haidilao first burst onto the scene, or when Tai did, they were huge. But today, people just see them as a regular dining option, right? In some areas, they might not even be that popular anymore, or they might even be in decline, right? And I think a similar phenomenon is actually happening in the baking industry. But, as Xiaoqi just said, to go from a viral hit to a lasting success, we need a clear definition of both. A viral hit might mean that when a brand first launches, it sees amazing above-average performance, right, with long queues forming. But we think that in the lasting success stage, it should have reasonable performance, reasonable queues, or even no queues at all. A good user experience is a sign of lasting success. While your performance supports a healthy single-store model, you don't need to make a fortune, but what you earn is enough to maintain the brand's healthy operation. Yes, we feel that if a brand can go from a viral hit to a lasting success and reach a certain scale, it's a very successful brand. For example, take Hollyland. When it first had 100 or 200 stores, every single one of them definitely had great performance, making millions. Now, with over 900 stores, performance might be in the hundreds of thousands, and some stores are even seeing a decline. But overall, if the brand as a whole still has a good profit model, we consider it a successful brand, including B&C that you mentioned. When it first opened, it might have made 2 or 3 million a month, or even more, right? But today, after 4 or 5 years or even longer, it can still achieve performance of over 1 million, right? It still has queues sometimes and good profits. I think it's a very successful brand that has weathered the cycles.
Yes, I think one very important factor in going from being a viral hit to achieving long-term popularity is how repeat purchases are established. Because in fact, products that remain popular over time are always able to find a stable group of people who are willing to keep repurchasing the product in a specific scenario. So I think a key point in building repeat purchases is figuring out what kind of people in what kind of scenarios will think of your product first or among the first. For example, take Luxihe's Taosu. I think they've managed to identify both the right scenario and the right audience. For instance, their Taosu tends to attract some relatively older customers who will consistently repurchase this product. In order to achieve this repeat purchase, they've actually put a lot of thought into the product itself. For example, their flour is custom made and the oil is consistently controlled to be extracted at, say, 5 degrees Celsius. This ensures that the crispiness and overall texture of the product are at their best. So I think the key behind turning a viral product into a long-lasting one is, first, you need to find a specific group of people and a specific scenario, and second, you really have to put effort into the product itself. And the last thing, which I think can't be ignored, is the price. In fact, if we look at various bakeries, including some Taosu products in retail channels, and compare them, we'll find that Luxihe sells a box of nearly 500 grams for just 12.9 yuan. This price is extremely competitive. No one would think it's not worth it. So, being able to pair a great product with a very attractive price while also securing a stable group of customers and fixed consumption scenarios, I think this is a very important characteristic for a product to go from being an internet sensation to achieving long-term popularity.
Yeah, right. Just now we actually talked about Luxihe. Strictly speaking, it should be classified under what we call the new Chinese style bakery category, right? It's probably not quite the same as B&C. Then I'd like to ask, do these two types of stores have significant differences in their single store models?
I think the differences in single store models aren't really divided by category, like Western style or Chinese style bakeries. It's more about how you design your business model. To put it simply, there are actually two types of models in the market right now. One is more of a comprehensive type, what we call a large bakery or a comprehensive bakery. For example, it could be located in a mall or a residential community, and it requires a relatively large space, right? For example, 200 square meters, 300 square meters, or even larger spaces. So generally, this model involves a large area and heavy investment, and correspondingly, its output, that is, its sales will also be higher. For example, it might achieve sales of over 1 million yuan per month, right? And the other type of model is more of a community store or a small store model. For example, if I run a single product store, like the well-known Kumo that sells cheesecakes, or some shops that make soufflés, or stores that focus on a few Chinese-style baked goods, these types of stores usually have a relatively small area, say 30 to 50 square meters. The corresponding investment and staffing needs are also relatively low, and as a result, their revenue will also be somewhat lower. Right, so as you just mentioned, a Chinese-style bakery like Luxihe might fall somewhere in between the two. From what I understand, B&C is definitely a large bakery, probably with an area of 200 to 300 square meters, and could achieve sales of around 1 million, right? There might be 30 to 40 staff members working inside, right? So Luxihe might also have these large stores of around 200 square meters, but at the same time, it also has some smaller community shops, for example, those that are about 50 to 80 square meters. Yes, I think the distinction isn't really between Chinese style and Western style, but more about differentiating between large stores and small stores.
So, can I understand it this way? Those who can open large stores tend to be more comprehensive, meaning their SKUs must be numerous, while those who can open small stores must have, for example, a very well-known and sharp single product, a hero product. Is that right?
Yes, because a comprehensive bakery might have a dozen types of bread categories, which would mean hundreds of SKUs. Like what Xia just mentioned, in bread alone, there might be European bread, toast, low hydration baguettes, bagels, and layered breads, right? There might also be cakes, cheesecakes, Swiss rolls, tiramisu, right? There are even some puff pastry items and Chinese style products. The variety of categories is extremely rich. Yes, but for smaller shops like these, they might only have a few items, like the sharp, best-selling products you just mentioned.
There are two dimensions here. One is customer flow, because for the same store, my capture rate for different groups of people, if my product range is rich enough, I can definitely attract more people. If you only have a single product, then customers who aren't interested in that product simply won't come in. But if I have a sufficiently diverse range of products, then the variety of customer profiles I can attract is much greater. Then there's another dimension, which is repeat purchases from existing customers. Just like Danny mentioned earlier about a single product, for example, you might easily get tired of it. But if my product range is rich enough, my regular customers might be willing to visit the store more often. So I think the impact on the average transaction value may not be that significant, but there will be a more noticeable effect on customer flow.
Just now, everyone actually mentioned a very important term, which is the product life cycle. And then I have an immature observation and summary of my own, which is that I've noticed actually among the products with relatively long life cycles that everyone can immediately think of, pork floss cake is one of them. This product is quite interesting because it has a bit of a fusion between Chinese and Western styles, and its consumer profile is broader, not just older people, but also young people. Basically, everyone might consume it. I'm not sure if that's really the case, but perhaps because it meets these conditions, its product life cycle can be a bit longer. For example, just now Sia mentioned that Luxihe's Taosu is actually a product that almost every Chinese person knows. But perhaps what Luxihe has improved is that it's not as sweet anymore, it's crispier, and maybe it suits the taste preferences of younger people better. At the same time, older people still eat it as well. For example, I have a colleague who gives her elementary school child taosu soaked in milk every morning. I think that's pretty interesting. Right, so what I specifically wanted to ask you just now is, for high-quality products like pork floss cake or perhaps taosu, do they typically tend to have a significantly longer and more sustainable product life cycle overall?
I think the product life cycle may have several dimensions. The first point, I think, is that your product needs to have broad appeal. Enough people need to be able to accept this flavor. I think that's a pretty important factor. The second point is that each individual customer should have a strong willingness to repurchase the product. It can't be something that everyone is willing to try once but then never buys again. When it comes to products that drive repeat purchases, I think it still comes back to what I mentioned earlier. You need to find a specific scenario for it, whether it's a mom preparing breakfast for her child, a quick breakfast for office workers, a meal replacement for dinner, or a packed meal for hiking. You have to find a concrete scenario to tie the product to.
I actually think that when we talk about life cycle, there are two dimensions. One dimension is what Xiaoqi just mentioned, which is the life cycle of a single product. And the other dimension, I think, is the life cycle of the brand. Yes, in the baking industry, I think it's important to clearly distinguish between the two. Because if a single product is a classic item, its life cycle is theoretically quite long. For example, in the Chinese-style baking you just mentioned, items like taosu and old-fashioned egg cakes are things our grandparents' generation started eating, and we still love them today. Kids nowadays will probably continue to enjoy them as well. So these are classic single products that have lasted for decades or even over 100 years. The same goes for Western-style items like egg tarts, cream puffs, and croissants, right? These are all single products with a very long history. So I think if a product is truly good, and it has been validated across different countries, regions, people, and generations, then in theory, the life cycle of such a single product is actually very long. Yes, these are classic products. Including in recent years, for example, as you mentioned, pork floss cake. In fact, many people in the industry believe that pork floss cake as a whole even saved the entire Chinese-style bakery industry. The launch by Bao Shifu and its application across all Chinese-style bakery brands made it a hugely popular product with a high proportion of sales, right? It allowed Chinese-style baking to begin to revive further, right? So I think this is what we call an innovative new product. It doesn't have a very long history, but because of its taste, right? For example, it has pork floss on top, cream inside, and a relatively soft bread base. Its taste, right, has been accepted by the public and has become established. So it's new. I think it's a new major single product that can even continue to endure. I think the life cycle of this kind of single product is actually very long. Yes, but on the other hand, we also see why so many internet famous bakery brands might be popular for a few years and then fade away, right? Some even completely disappear from the scene. I think this probably comes down to the life cycle of the brand itself, right? Because your single product will be diluted by competition. For example, if I make a pork floss cake today, you might be the original creator of this product, but I could find similar products being sold in almost any bakery. So what makes you think you can establish yourself with just this one product? You actually need to give consumers a really good reason to buy, right? If you can't continuously iterate on innovation and differentiation, then you may gradually be eliminated by market competition or by newer things.
That's right. The third point, I think, is that if we go back to the dimension of a single product, a good or long-lasting single product may actually have a platform attribute. On one hand, the product itself can be iterated upon, and on the other hand, the way it is consumed can also be iterated. For example, with this Luxihe, after I paired it with butter rice cake, I will continue to iterate on butter rice cake. That is, there will be taro butter rice cake, sweet potato butter rice cake, and various cheese butter rice cake. Essentially, I am continuously evolving and enriching the product around a single item, building out its product matrix. Another example, like what Xiaoqi just mentioned about the Taosu product, I can also change the way it's consumed. For instance, I can make it in smaller sizes, right? Then I can make a version with added nuts like walnut Taosu, and I can even soak it in milk to eat. So its diversity is actually constantly evolving. That is, for different groups of people, I can have many variations in the overall form of the product to suit their needs in different scenarios. So I think if a major single product wants to remain vital over time, it must be based on a certain platform and then continuously develop and add new derivatives on top of it.
Yes, as everyone just mentioned, pork floss cake and Taosu are currently two of the most popular bestsellers in the Chinese-style bakery category. But here I have a new question. We all know that in Western-style baking, the major bestsellers have been validated by a very long history, like croissants, cream puffs, egg tarts, and so on. So for Chinese-style baking, everyone might actually face the same problem. If all the brands are making the same classic bestsellers, why should you buy mine instead of someone else's? So in this regard, how can you create differentiation?
I think that's a very good question. And when it comes to Western-style baking and Chinese-style baking, I think there are different ways to approach this. Because in Western-style baking, for example, since when we talk about Western baking, it generally refers to bread and cakes, right? Bread is mainly things like European-style loaves, toast, and savory breads. So to create differentiation here, it definitely still comes down to the product itself. How do you make the product taste better, right? So one of the solutions that everyone has found now is actually baking on site. That is making my bread fresher, right? Just like what Zia mentioned earlier, it has a stronger aroma and is steaming hot. Maybe on your side, the bread is pre-made, but here it might be freshly baked by the baker. So in terms of the overall experience and the taste of the product, I can have a slight edge. Right, so this is one way that everyone in Western-style baking is differentiating themselves by increasingly raising the proportion of freshly baked products. Exactly. So that's why we see that some of the large bakeries in shopping malls today, which might be 200 to 300 square meters, may require 80 to 90 employees. That's because over 80% of their products need to be freshly baked and made by hand. Actually, it's a very labor-intensive industry. Right, so this is exactly what you mentioned. Why do I buy from you and not from the shop across the street? Because the shop across the street might be using products made in a central factory, reheating frozen dough. But here today, I have a baker who makes and bakes it fresh for you. So naturally, there's a huge difference in the product experience. I would choose the freshly baked product, and consumers will naturally make that choice as well. I think this is one of the directions everyone is competing in within Western-style baking. But in Chinese-style baking, we find that, for example, whether it's Taosu or traditional egg cakes, many of these products are actually industrialized. They can be mass-produced on a large scale through central factories. So at this point, factory production might focus on efficiency. Just like Xia mentioned earlier, I can sell 500 grams for 16 yuan, right? But if you use freshly made methods or more scattered small-scale production, your cost might be over a dozen yuan or even higher. So I might rely on the efficiency of factory production to achieve a leading position in terms of product cost effectiveness. Right? So I think in different categories, the ways and paths of competition might also be different. Some may rely on competing in terms of value and experience, while others may focus on price and cost effectiveness.
Let me briefly summarize what Danny just said. Can I understand it this way? Actually, Western-style baking is more focused on competing through the experience, especially the point you just mentioned about freshly baked goods requiring a lot of staff. This kind of competition might lead to a lack of economies of scale. But for Chinese-style baking, another approach is that it's entirely possible to achieve economies of scale.
I think this might be related to the characteristics of the category. If your product itself has relatively weak repeat purchase rates and is more about novelty and experience, then at certain stages, it may show that you need more of that in-store, freshly baked experience, faster product launches, and more variety for consumers to see, so they're willing to come to your store. But if this product gradually settles into a situation where the user base is defined, the target audience is clear, the usage scenarios are set, and the repeat purchase attribute becomes stronger, then I think the importance of scale effects will gradually increase. So I think in the end, the bakery business will ultimately combine both scale effects and experience. So I think flexibility is also a very important factor here. That is to say, part of the process can be completed at the back end, but at the same time, I can also flexibly match the needs of front-end customers, whether I need to bake on site or go directly with industrialized distribution. I think this is something that can be switched between.
Could you give us an example of this? Is there a brand that both makes products fresh in store and also has a portion delivered from a factory?
Actually, Luxihe is just like this. For example, with Luxihe, about 40% of their products are freshly baked in store. Products like butter rice cake are relatively easy to prepare, so they don't add much extra workload for store staff. At the same time, this approach gives consumers a better sensory experience. The smell and taste are always the hottest and freshest. At the same time, 60% of the products are made in the factory, such as tausu, old-fashioned egg cakes, mung bean cakes, and some types of ice cakes. These can be produced directly in the factory, which gives them significant advantages in terms of scale and cost efficiency. Therefore, customers who care about price can also find some highly competitively priced yet delicious best-selling products at Luxihe. So, being able to find a balance between freshly baked products and supply chain efficiency is actually very important here.
Yes, following up on the question just now from Xiaoqi, I actually think it's just as you said. This really requires a brand to make a choice, that is, to strike a balance between experience and efficiency. Right, if everything is freshly baked, for example, the large bakeries we now see in shopping malls, you might need 50 or even 100 staff members. In that case, it's definitely not economically scalable, and maybe you could only open a few dozen such stores nationwide, right? But if everything is pre-made, then I might be able to open thousands or even tens of thousands of stores. But in terms of value for consumers, it's probably more about meeting essential needs and the functional requirements of the product. So you also need to look at your brand's specific positioning and what kind of value you provide to consumers. And actually, as Zia mentioned, you can strike a balance in between, so you can offer a certain level of experience while also meeting efficiency needs.
Just now, Danny shared that some bakeries that focus on experience and freshly baked goods may require as many as 80 to 100 staff members. Honestly, I find that number quite astonishing. So I want to ask specifically, if you need that many staff, how do you make the numbers work?
Actually, a bakery with 80 or 90 staff is quite an extreme case in the industry. Basically, that's the staffing configuration for the largest type of bakery. And as mentioned earlier, there are usually 2 or 3 shifts. So in reality, the number of people present in the store at any given time is more like 30 or 40. So if we do the math, we actually need to look at it from the other direction. For example, a large bakery might be around 300 square meters, and if it has 80 or 90 staff, then the monthly labor cost could reach Y500,000 to Y600,000. If we look at the normal proportion of labor costs, for a large bakery it might be around 20%. That means its ideal revenue would be between 2.5 million and 3 million yuan. Correspondingly, this would also represent the performance of a leading large-scale bakery. Right, so the challenge for this kind of store is what level of regular sales revenue it can maintain after its initial popularity declines. Yes, if we calculate it this way, its break-even point is probably around 1.5 million yuan.
Wow, a break-even point of 1.5 million. Let's do the math. So that means I need to sell 50,000 yuan worth every day. If the unit price of a loaf of bread is between 10 and 15 yuan, then how much foot traffic do I need in a day?
You need to sell 50,000 yuan a day, with an average spend of 25 yuan each. About 2,000 customers buying from the store daily.
So for this type of bakery you mentioned, can I understand it as basically only being able to choose shopping centers with high foot traffic?
Yes, there are probably only about 20 to 30 of these flagship bakeries across the country, and they're basically all located in the top high-traffic shopping centers in each city.
Can you give us an example of a bakery that has achieved this level of performance?
I think stores like B&C in top locations in many cities can do it. For example, B&C in Sanlitun, Beijing, or U-Health in Hobson 1, and Rukuganghao at Mix Mall, they can basically achieve sales of over 2,000.
Let's continue then. For example, how much would I need to invest up front? And for the kind of case you just mentioned, how long would it typically take for me to recoup my investment?
Actually, the investment required for a bakery can vary. Some are high, some are low. For example, as I mentioned earlier, for a labor-intensive bakery with a relatively large area, the cost to set up the store can be quite high, basically around 4 to 5 million yuan. Yes, and it also needs to achieve sales of 2 to 3 million yuan. Correspondingly, the overall cash flow profit margin for a bakery is typically around 15%. So you can think of it this way. For a store with sales of 2.5 million yuan at a 15% profit margin, that's about 400,000 yuan in cash flow profit per month. With an investment of 4 to 5 million yuan, you could recoup your costs in about a year. But this is based on the premise that you can maintain that high level of sales, 2 to 3 million yuan. But in reality, for many of these internet-famous stores, they might hit 2 to 3 million yuan in sales when they first open, but once things stabilize, they're usually only doing between 1.5 and 2 million yuan. Right, so if that's the case, the payback period will be significantly extended. Right, so in our view, we think these kinds of stores are actually quite risky. If their momentum or traffic can't be sustained, or if 2 or 3 competitors open up nearby, it can have a significant impact on the overall store operation model, including the payback period, so the risks are relatively high. These kinds of stores are basically high-risk, high-reward ventures.
Yes, what you said just reminded me. If I remember correctly, it was earlier this year when Hobson One was about to open a Mr. Stone Oven bakery store. I actually found out about this bakery from the subway station. I thought it was amazing because for a bakery store to be able to blanket the subway with advertisements, the cost must be pretty high. So even before it opened, I had already been bombarded with its information. So when it opened, I actually went to Hobson One as well. At that time, I think U Health was also opening. If I remember correctly, U Health was on the first floor, but this Mr. Stone Oven was on basement 1. Back then, both basement 1 and the first floor were packed with people lining up to buy bread. It was really over the top. The line for U Health on the first floor wrapped around the central atrium of HeyGen, and it was about 2 full loops long. As for Mr. Stone Oven on basement 1, during the first few days, it was basically impossible to buy anything because every time you wanted to go, either everything was sold out or there were just too many people. That was pretty much the situation. I'm not really sure how these two stores are doing now.
As you just mentioned, these are probably the two most phenomenal bakeries at Beijing Hobson One this year. Yes, one is U Health on basement 1 and the other is Mr. Stone Oven on basement 2. Just as we said earlier, both stores performed extremely well at the beginning, but after being open for a while, their sales have started to diverge quite significantly. In fact, one reason for this divergence is that the competition among bakeries within Hobson One is extremely fierce. As we know, inside Hobson One there's not only B&C, right, there's U Health, a bakery of over 300 square meters, Mr. Stone Oven is also over 300 square meters, and soon comprehensive stores like Yili, which offer both baked goods and roasted snacks, will also open. So overall, the supply of bread is very abundant. At the same time, in these large malls, there aren't just comprehensive bakeries, there are also specialty shops focused on specific baked goods. For example, Rolling specializes in Swiss rolls, Foofaland makes soufflés, and there are shops dedicated to egg tarts. The number of bakeries focusing on niche categories is practically countless. There are probably 20 or 30 of them. Right, so in the long run, even in a mall with extremely high foot traffic, once there are 10 or 20 or more competing stores of various types, even the most promising shops will see their performance siphoned off. So we know that among them there might be a store whose sales dropped from over 2 million at opening to even half that, or experienced a significant decline in performance. I think that's completely normal. On one hand, this comes from the diversion caused by competition, and on the other hand, I think it comes from the competitiveness of the product itself. Right, because bread is still a high frequency, high demand consumer product, so its repeat purchase rate and sustained performance actually depend to a large extent on the competitiveness of the product.
I'd like to ask Sia here, as a bread enthusiast when it comes to those stores we just mentioned with extremely long lines, personally, I wouldn't wait in a long queue to buy baked goods. From my own perspective, I don't really like eating products that are too high in calories. But to make a baked good taste really good, you actually need to use quite a bit of sugar and fat, so I generally wouldn't line up to buy those super popular trending products. But the low hydration breads that I often buy myself are actually pretty standard products that many stores carry, so you usually don't have to wait in line to get them. So personally, I don't really line up for these products. I remember at the time it was probably Danny who bought quite a lot of U Health bread and brought them back to the office for everyone to try, right? Did you line up for them yourself back then?
I actually hired a scalper to wait in line for me. So when it comes to bread, these trendy, internet-famous bakeries have actually created a whole industry for scalpers. Even if you hire a scalper, they still have to wait in line. Back then, it took over 2 hours, and I remember the purchasing service fee was about 50 yuan, and the scalper's fee was also around 50 yuan. Right, so basically, when a trendy bakery or beverage shop first opens, if you want to be among the first to try their products, you usually have to pay an extra 50 to 100 yuan as a purchasing service fee. Even today, if you go to the entrance of B&C in Sanlitun Taikuli, there are probably still scalpers selling their products. I remember the first time I went to Sanlitun to eat at B&C, I saw a lot of people there, even though it was already pretty late in the afternoon. Yeah, at that time, a scalper came up to me and asked if I wanted one of the products from inside. Basically, he had already put together some of the most popular items into a bag, told you a price, and if you wanted to try it, you could just buy it directly.
So basically, the scalper is just selling it to you and making a profit from the price difference in the middle. That's pretty much how it feels.
I remember when B&C opened in Shenyang, it was said that people had to wait in line for 4 or 5 hours. A lot of people would start lining up for B&C at Shenyang Mixi as early as 4 or 5 in the morning. At that time, one thing everyone mentioned in their friend circles was that if you bought B&C in Beijing and drove to Shenyang to sell it, you could make a lot of money.
That's interesting. I remember a few days ago, there was a heavy snowfall in Beijing and it was really cold. There was a picture circulating online showing people lining up in Sanlitun with a really long queue to buy bread. That should have been for B&C as well.
Yes, the opening of this B&C at Joy City.
Right, we just talked a lot about a bakery, your store opening costs, your labor, and your payback period, all these issues. And here I actually saw a piece of data saying that last year and this year, baking has already become a hotspot for attracting businesses in many shopping malls. In some places, it has even caught up with or surpassed tea shops. So, Danny, you actually have a lot of research on tea drinks and have been following the industry for a long time. I want to ask, from the perspective of attracting businesses besides what we just mentioned, like how trendy bakeries have this queuing effect, what other factors would I need to consider?
I think from the perspective of attracting businesses, as you said, Xiaoxin, there are mainly two key metrics. The first is whether bringing in this brand can generate new buzz and new foot traffic for my mall, right? So these trendy brands are generally quite welcome because when they open, there's often a huge buzz with people lining up, which actually serves as great advertising for the mall's brand as well. But I think the second dimension is also something everyone cares about because once you give the best locations and relatively large spaces to a brand like this, you actually have to pay a pretty high rent for it. For the company, and for leasing in particular, rental income is actually a core consideration. But when we talk about rental income, it should really be about the returns over the entire life cycle. When I bring in a brand, I'm not just looking for you to be popular for a month or two and pay me high rent during that time. What I really hope is that over the next 3 to even 5 years, you can continuously generate positive rental income for me. So whether a brand can become a hit and whether it can sustain that success, I think is also a core indicator. If you can only be popular for a week or a month, and then your performance quickly drops to the point where you can't even break even, I think that's actually quite a headache for the mall as well. Right, so what they really want are brands that can not only have a sensational opening, but can also continue to deliver relatively stable performance and steady profits.
To meet the 2 points you just mentioned, isn't it only B&C that comes to mind?
I think looking at it historically, the brands that have managed to endure have basically all been able to achieve this. For example, take Hollyland that we see in shopping malls. Although its performance today may not be the most outstanding, overall, its average performance still yields relatively good returns. Also, as we mentioned earlier, actually, UHealth in many cities, if it happens to be in many of these new malls, its overall performance is also quite stable. It just doesn't stay as explosively popular as it was at the grand opening. Yes, but even after stabilizing, its performance can still support a decent, profitable outcome.
Let's continue comparing with tea drinks. Does baking generally require a higher investment than tea drinks? I've seen a statement saying that if you open a typical mixed bakery, your investment might be twice that of a tea drink shop. I'm not sure if that statement is accurate.
I think overall, the investment in baking is higher than in tea drinks. Of course, the size of a bakery and the overall investment in equipment are usually higher as well, right? Once you have a bakery of 200 to 300 square meters, the investment in ovens and other equipment is actually quite significant because we know that baking equipment is quite expensive. For some large bakeries, just the investment in equipment alone can reach around $1,000,000 or so. Actually, it's mainly because the area is larger. For tea shops, you can open one with just 30 to 50 square meters, and 100 square meters is already considered large. For bakeries, 100 square meters is considered small.
Just now, Danny, you mentioned that equipment investment is a major part for bakeries. Is this equipment investment only necessary if my store needs to bake on-site? If I use the front shop back factory model, would my investment be a bit smaller?
Right, I think the back of house and on-site prep don't really conflict. Actually, there are a few main formats for bakeries nowadays. One is where everything is baked fresh in store. You have ovens, and even the dough proofing happens right there. So the entire production line is within the store itself. Then there's another type like tous les jours or Paris baguette. They actually have some in-store par baking steps. Frozen dough arrives and then some breads are finished in the oven. Now, par baking still requires some oven equipment, but the investment in machinery is relatively lighter, right? And the third type might be the pre-made bread you mentioned. Like it's finished at the factory and then sold in-store. This is more like a small retail shop format. Just like the bread we buy at convenience stores or hypermarkets, it's made in a factory and then delivered to the store. Right, but these kinds of stores aren't very common in malls anymore because the competitiveness of factory-delivered bread and the overall experience are indeed significantly weaker.
Well, let's get specific. For example, Hollyland, is it, as I understand it, more of a retail store format?
Yes, for Hollyland, actually, right now, maybe 40% of the products in store are retail style items made in a central factory, right? And then about 30% might be some fresh baked breads.
Like Saya mentioned before, Luxihe actually has 40% baked fresh in store. But as everyone knows, its flagship products are taosu and old egg cakes. Those don't really need to be baked fresh in store. So the factory delivery model accounts for 60%. So I want to ask, can I understand this format as being able to invest in stores at a lower cost and then gain more economies of scale?
Yes, exactly. For Luxihe, it has actually built up more capabilities on the back end and invested a lot of capital to create this barrier. So the front-end store setup is much leaner, whether it's the staffing or the store's square footage, or even the final total capital investment for the store. Compared to some of the top-tier hit stores Danny just mentioned, it's much lower, so it's actually following a model that's replicable and scalable for expansion. We also visited their factory. It's actually a production line with very large-scale investment. In fact, most items like their taosu and old-fashioned sponge cakes can be produced in large batches at the factory. This translates to the front end as a price-performance advantage, and it also saves a lot on in-store labor costs, as well as the store's physical footprint.
Actually, Luxihe also has stores of different sizes, which correspond to different investments and brand functions. For instance, we know that a standard Luxihe store's area is probably around 80 square meters, but it also has some flagship and experience stores of 200 to 300 square meters, right? Even in cities like Nanjing, where store density is high, it has some specialty stores, theme stores, and souvenir shops. I remember Xia went to Nanjing before and actually visited their souvenir shop specifically and took many wonderful photos there.
Right, when I went to Nanjing at the landmark scenic spot Laomendong, I actually saw this souvenir shop opened by Luxihe. After going in, besides their core signature products, they also specially added many souvenir products. Actually, at this level, Luxihe can already be considered a city business card for Nanjing, because we can see it has over 300 stores in Jiangsu, and in Nanjing alone, there are nearly 100 stores. So this density in Nanjing is already considered a very high-density brand.
I think this is actually quite an achievement. For example, when people travel to Beijing, they might think of bringing back a box of daoxiangchun when they leave, right? When we first came to Beijing, maybe every year, when we first started working in Beijing, every year when we went back home, we might also buy a few boxes of daoxiangchun. Now, I think when people travel to Nanjing, the core souvenir they think of might also be Luxihe, because we often have colleagues going to Nanjing on business, and when they return, they also bring back 2 boxes of Luxihe's taosu. But I think as Luxihe's stores increase nationwide, this might not be so rare anymore. For instance, when there were no Luxihe stores in Beijing, you'd go to Nanjing and bring back a box of Luxihe taosu, which felt very novel. But today, Luxihe has 30 or 40 stores in Beijing, and when it becomes a brand for your daily consumption, it might not be such a unique souvenir product anymore.
You just mentioned souvenirs, and I thought of a very interesting point. I've been watching Divas Hit the Road before, and I remember in one episode, Na Ying took leave to fly back to Shenyang for a music festival, and when she returned, she actually brought many boxes of Luxihe.
Yes.
Later, netizens found out it was Luxihe. And there's another interesting point. When Gong Jun was preparing hot pot, he actually used Luxihe, crushing the taosu to make the base. Hey, that's the first time I've seen that way of eating. To be honest, I was sold on it by a TV show. This idea of using taosu to fry hot pot base, it's quite amazing.
Actually, taosu is quite a magical product. Just the other day I was watching Amazing Night, and Wang Tianfang was devouring taosu cookies, stuffing a handful into his mouth, and all those crumbs bursting out was quite hilarious. Later, Ma Dong actually asked him, "Why did you choose taosu for this performance?" He said, "Well, I actually tried many kinds of food to see the comedic effect. Finally, I found that if I stuffed bread into my mouth, it was very hard for me to speak, so I wanted both the comedic effect and to be able to speak clearly. In the end, I found that the crumbly and explosive effect of taosu was quite suitable for this form of expression."
Right. These 2 shows we mentioned probably weren't ads placed by Luxihe, right? I guess it's all just organic word of mouth.
It's all word of mouth, pure word of mouth.
I think I'll go a little off topic for a moment. Actually, souvenirs really are a market with a lot of potential. I remember that when I traveled to Japan in the airports and train stations, there were so many beautifully crafted and exquisite souvenir desserts. Yes, they are Japan's desserts and retailized baked goods, right? So every time people come back from Japan, they bring back a lot of these souvenirs. But I think in China, the overall supply of souvenirs is still very scarce. Yes, I think we're still far from the point where you can find great products like that on every street in Japan. There's still a long way to go.
Right, but China actually has many regional resources or good assets that can be explored. For example, Jiahua's flour cakes in Yunnan. In fact, relying on the signature product of flour cakes, it has reached a scale of several billion. Including in terms of cultural perception and the actual product flavor, they have achieved great differentiation, so I think Chinese brands still have a huge opportunity in the souvenir market.
Actually, I don't think that was off topic. Talking about souvenirs reminded me that when you think of souvenirs, it's either candy or baked goods. And then, for example, Chai'an USA in Hunan is a rather special phenomenon. It has become a souvenir icon for the entire city of Changsha and even the entire province. So thinking back to what Danny just said, I have this feeling that in China, perhaps souvenirs are not a separate category. It's more like for any product, whether it's a tea drink, a baked good, or candy, as long as it becomes very successful, it has the potential to become an icon of the city. It's not that my positioning now is to make a souvenir. That's how I feel at the moment. And you can clearly feel that the so-called popular souvenirs of our generation are already very different from the previous generations. There's a significant difference. For example, you just mentioned Daoxiang Kun. I actually buy it less often now. Maybe 10 years ago, I would have considered it a souvenir. But now, what souvenir would I buy in Beijing? I might choose a product from a local viral shop. That's probably the logic.
Right. So I think what you said is exactly the opportunity in China's souvenir industry today. I think there's a huge business opportunity. It's actually an opportunity on the same level as the tea drink industry 10 years ago or the baking industry 5 years ago. Yes, because consumer generations are changing. Like you said, in the past, people's souvenirs might have been from Daoxiangkun. But today, if I go to Beijing, the souvenir I bring back might be an exquisite cake from Tangsuo. Right. And my average spending might also change from tens of yuan for those snacks to a 2 or even 300 yuan cake. This is in line with the increase in people's income levels and spending power, right? So I think souvenirs are definitely, well, it's a bit off topic, but I think souvenirs are definitely a very good track today, right? Of course, today's souvenirs, as you said, are more about products refined from some viral bakeries and cake shops. But I think as we move forward, China will also have specialized souvenir shops, just like Japan. And within those classic brands, there will definitely be separate product lines to provide consumers with products for a better souvenir experience.
Right. There's actually another point here. For example, with a nationally famous brand like Hollyland, I've noticed they create themed products based on local city characteristics. For instance, if you go to a Hollyland in Chengdu, their stores will sell those panda-shaped half-baked cheesecakes. They have products like that. This can serve as a souvenir option for you, giving it a bit of a city-exclusive feel. Actually, we've talked so much about souvenirs, and I think to some extent it can be seen as an extended business line for a bakery brand. Maybe I don't even need on-site baking, because products baked fresh in-store actually have a very short shelf life. I might focus more on retail-oriented products. So is it possible that the revenue ceiling for bakery stores could be pushed even higher?
I think for the bakery industry, looking at the global market, I'm sure both fresh made and retail will have huge room for growth. But for a single brand, retail can definitely open up a much higher ceiling. Because fresh made and freshly baked, as mentioned just now, you'll definitely be limited by the scale of the store and also by the scale of the channels. Right, but if you can open up retail channels, the room for imagination is actually much larger. The growth rate will also be much faster than just linear store expansion. For example, we know that after Luxi's Taosu entered Sam's Club in a very short time, less than a year, it might have reached 300 to 500 million in sales. But if you translate that 300 to 500 million in sales back to stores, you might need to open hundreds of stores, right, to achieve a similar volume of sales. So the combination of retail products and super channels, I think, is also a very big opportunity for the retailization of bakery products in the future. Because I think today the largest output for a single bakery store or a single site is no longer in shopping malls, but in the super channels everyone is familiar with, like Sam's Club or Pangdonglai. Now we know that a single Pangdonglai supermarket can have daily bakery sales of around 100,000 to 300,000. But as we mentioned earlier, those top tier brands in malls might only have sales in the tens of thousands. I heard news before that Pangdonglai is even planning a bakery store that can do 300,000 to 500,000 in daily sales. But it hasn't been implemented yet.
Okay, we just mentioned another channel that might take a piece of the bakery business pie. This point is actually very crucial. So here I'd actually like to ask, in such a highly competitive environment, does it mean if I'm building a bakery brand, I have to go the internet famous route to have higher momentum and more competitive advantages through differentiation?
I think from an investment perspective, there might be two paths to choose from. One is the experience route that Xiaoqi mentioned. That is, can I provide a more differentiated user experience and offer the highest user value? In that case, my store's decor, display, the proportion of fresh-made items, and the overall atmosphere are very critical, just like B&C or Rukuganghao, these kinds of new brands. In their stores, they can actually keep breaking records and creating higher output, right? 2 million, 3 million, 5 million, or even more. I think this is one path, but naturally, this path is actually anti-scale. Because the number of these high traffic malls in China is very limited. Looking across the country, there might only be 20 or 30 of them, right? So the ceiling for this type of brand might also be around 100 or 200 stores. It might not be possible to open them everywhere, right? So I think another path might be relying on your ultimate supply chain to balance the ratio of freshly made and retail products, right? In the future, retail might even become a larger portion of your revenue contribution. Because with retail, you can supply both the front-end stores and also what Xiaoqi just mentioned. Sam's Club, Pangdonglai, and these supermarkets. Basically, any place that sells baked goods will become your channel. In that case, your supply chain efficiency can be maximized, then your front-end sales can also be maximized, and you become the infrastructure of this industry. I think this is an opportunity to create a 10 billion level or even larger scale company.
Right, because as we just discussed, bakery brands are also entering retail channels, and retail channels themselves have a large number of bakery products. So there's some overlap and competition between these two channels. One interesting finding is that we actually made a bunch of consumer calls earlier and found that although competition exists, they are actually complementary, or rather, their target audiences are not completely overlapping. For instance, for Sam's Club bakery users, their primary reason for going to Sam's Club isn't actually the bakery. For them, baked goods are an incidental purchase category. A very important reason why they choose Sam's Club is because Sam's Club offers large quantities and strong value for money. We did a price comparison at the time and found that for the same categories, Sam's Club's price per gram is still very attractive. But a big issue with Sam's Club is that its sizes are quite fixed. So for a 1 or 2 person small household, it's actually hard to consume the product within a short time or before the expiration date. Now, as for bakery store customers, they are more about higher frequency daily purchases. And they might care more about the product's freshness, whether it's freshly baked, and the overall experience like the aroma, to see if it gives a good feeling rather than just seeing a cold packaged product shipped from a factory. So they care more about this kind of immediate consumption and the comprehensive experience advantage felt on site, whether it's sensory, taste, or visual presentation. Therefore, in our view, these two channels actually help each other raise the ceiling and scale of the bakery category, but they each have their own key points of competition. In fact, there are different requirements for the corresponding companies. For example, Freshippo's audience, because Freshippo's sizes are relatively small, their audience values the advantage that Freshippo introduces new products frequently enough, so I often think about going there to try something new. But for Sam's Club, it actually has some stable hero products, like its durian, daifuku, toast, and so on. Everyone knows these classic hero products, and people are willing to stock up and repurchase them in large quantities, so their purpose is actually tied to the attributes of the channel itself. It's also related, so it's not like all retail channels
are just for families. That's not the case. If I recall correctly, people used to have a slight doubt about bakery products, which is that their consumption frequency is definitely lower than that of milk tea. To put it simply, you might feel full after eating just one piece of bread, but with milk tea, you might drink 1 cup a day, or some people might even drink 2 or 3 cups, and that's totally fine. Regarding this, it actually involves the issue of consumption scenarios. In other words, when we buy bakery products, what exactly are we paying for? So we can summarize this a bit at the end. Actually, Xia has previously conducted a very in-depth consumer survey. Let's have her share some of the data she observed from her research.
On this point, I think the frequency being lower than milk tea is indeed true. Based on the user interviews we conducted at the time, I can give you a general idea, which is that the frequency of users buying milk tea and coffee is about 200 times a year, while for fresh bakery products it's nearly 60 times. Ice cream is nearly 40 times, and roasted nuts are 11 times. So you can see that although there is indeed a gap, bakery is still a relatively high-frequency industry. I think frequency is also related to the number of competitors and the competitive landscape. Overall, the competitive landscape for bakery is still relatively better than for milk tea. Now, looking at specific scenarios, we found an interesting one. Most people still consume bakery products mainly as casual snacks. This scenario accounts for nearly 60%, while breakfast is nearly 30%. There are also scenarios like office afternoon tea and on-the-go consumption. So we can see that the greater potential for growth in bakery actually comes from a breakthrough in the breakfast scenario. I think there's another interesting finding to share. The distribution of these scenarios is very different between first and second tier cities and lower tier markets. The distribution is very different. We see that in first and second tier cities, because of the density of bakery shops and the large number of trendy shops, the breakfast scenario for consumers in high tier cities accounts for 30 to 50%. However, in third tier cities, breakfast accounts for less than 20%. An interesting point here is that the average transaction value for bakery products is still quite high. While this might be acceptable in first and second tier cities for third and fourth tier cities, they still prefer cheaper options like steamed buns, noodles, and millet porridge. Compared to bakery products that often cost over 10 yuan, the price is a major challenge for the popularity of bakery breakfasts in lower-tier markets. Therefore, as bakery chains expand into these markets, they will need to tailor their product mix to meet the specific needs of those users.
Shay just mentioned breakfast and the lower-tier markets. We actually looked at a bakery company in Inner Mongolia before. They make retail-oriented products, kind of like a lower-tier version of Toli. As mentioned, 10 yuan might be the price of one bread in a first-tier city, but there, 10 yuan can buy a big bag with maybe 8 to 10 pieces. For a bread like that, the average cost of a breakfast would probably be just 2 to 3 yuan. So in Tongliao, Inner Mongolia, which is just a small city, they can achieve sales of over 100 million yuan. Many people will buy their bread as a breakfast substitute for traditional steamed buns and mantou. So we think lower tier bakery has huge potential and opportunity. And for Chinese people to change their consumption habits and breakfast diet, it definitely depends on a product penetration and value for money. When the price of bread is exactly the same as that of steamed buns, I think that more people will likely choose bread for their breakfast.
Right, everyone mentioned that bakery still has huge room for penetration in lower tier markets, but the prerequisite might be the price. To be blunt, the price might need to go down a bit more and the product needs to suit more people's tastes. I have one last quick question. I saw a report a couple of days ago about 80,000 bakery shops closing in a year, even those with long queues. It says the bakery industry has gone from rapid expansion to a stage of intense competition and elimination. Many brands have already closed down. Some media even defined 2025 as the year one of bakery involution. I want to know, Danny, what's your take?
Well, in China's highly competitive market, especially when we look at the consumer industry, this kind of intense competition is happening in every single category you can think of. For example, today's tea drinks, specialty coffee shops, bakeries, and even the broader catering and food service industry are all extremely competitive, with new brands and products constantly emerging. As I mentioned earlier, top bakery brands in particular can easily make 2 to 3 million yuan a month, sometimes even more, while their supply chains. And it's not just limited to bakeries. Other sectors are seeing similar trends as well. It provides extreme value for money. So those caught in the middle, like traditional bakeries or mom and pop shops, are feeling the squeeze and finding it very difficult. In a mall, I'll either pick the trendiest one or the cheapest one. Exactly. So for brands positioned in the middle, their survival space will naturally get narrower and narrower, which eventually leads to falling below the cost line and significant store closures. So I think the bakery industry will go through this process of intense competition, then a shakeout, and finally a few top brands will remain. This is a pattern seen in developed countries as well, where after a period of many companies competing, only a few major brands end up dominating the market. For example, in industries like technology or automobiles, a handful of top players hold most of the market share, while other brands that are different or unique manage to carve out smaller specialized segments. So, just as in those markets, a few leading brands become widely recognized and the rest find their own space by offering something distinct to specific groups of customers. This whole process will definitely be quite painful for those working in the industry, whether they are in the middle or at the very top, because even the top brands also have to invest heavily in marketing in order to maintain their competitive edge.
All right. Thanks, Danny and Xia. Regarding the breakfast scenario mentioned, as an ordinary consumer, I have a major pain point that's unaddressed. Simply put, there's no breakfast to eat, right? Especially when working in Beijing. If a suitable bakery brand appears and provides products that I won't get tired of, I'd be more than happy to have them for breakfast. All right, that's all for today's show. Goodbye. Bye-bye.